Hi, I'm Rhianna Schmitz, Steve Corey's granddaughter. Before I introduce Grandpa, I want to ask you 3 questions. Do you think it's ridiculous to propose archaeology's most mysterious pillar found in mankind's most ancient temple might have something to do with the return of Jesus Christ? Do you find it insane to think the fast-approaching asteroid Apophis might portend his arrival? Is it absurd to believe the Bible might imply they do? If you answered yes to those questions, then you need to watch this entire video while recalling Jesus' arrival in Jerusalem on the first Palm Sunday. The whole multitude of his disciples were rejoicing and praising God, chanting, "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord." But some Pharisees called for Jesus to rebuke their chant. Jesus calmly replied to them, "I tell you, if these were silent, the very stones would cry out." Over the last 3 centuries, scientific theories and speculations have silenced the multitudes of the whole world from rejoicing and praising Jesus Christ for his works and his coming returns. Therefore, just as Jesus said stones would do such in silence, this pillar and that asteroid, one made by human hands millennia ago, and the other presently hurled towards earth by God's hands, are now crying out all the glory of Jesus' work while affirming the prophecy of his return. Listen and think carefully as my grandpa introduces more of this very amazing, most real phenomena to you. Here's Grandpa.
Thank you, Rennie. Today, I will finish introducing to you the recent discovery of the most amazing physical phenomena since Einstein's relativity, the life-defining genome, and black holes. This discovery is not the speculation, theory, or guessing science has only been able to make about your origin and destiny. Charles Darwin could only assume the universe was not designed, yet he proclaimed it was, as if he knew it to be a fact. He could only speculate that it served no purpose at all, yet science followed his pathway of guesses as if they were facts. But our series of videos will present to you neither theory nor speculation, but the universe's own empirical evidence proclaiming the universe's grand design for a very communicative purpose. Evidence is the source of facts, not guesses or speculations. My first video, Gobekli Tepe, Noah's monument to God's Ark, showed you the biblical narrative of the Great Flood carved across the top of archaeology's most mysterious pillar, Pillar 43, of mankind's most ancient stone temple, Gobekli Tepe. If you haven't watched it, or if you clicked out of it in mid-session, you need to see this Neolithic portrayal of the Great Flood. It sat in front of the modern world's eyes for 30 years before it was finally noticed. So delusionally groupthink, popular demand, and even peer review have legitimized guessing and speculation. But in these videos, we are going to explore and think in accord only with actual evidence. We are going to leave groupthink in the dust and popular demand in the dark. Gobekli Tepe and Pillar 43 were discovered near the area of southeast Turkey where ancient Mesopotamian myths and legends placed the Garden of Eden. A few hundred miles northeast are the Ararat Mountains where those ancient myths, as well as the Bible, placed the landing of Noah's Ark. If we were to expect to find an ancient monument to mankind's survival of a global flood anywhere, it would be here. The Gobekli Tepe area has an interesting, very real connection with the divine, going beyond even that. It is only 7.5 miles northeast of present-day Sanliurfa, where the Empire of Edessa was the first to convert its religion from paganism to Christianity. Jesus' burial cloth had been taken there early in the 1st century AD to heal the emperor of a terminal disease. It was kept there as a relic because it bore an amazing image of a crucified man, as we like to say it today, an image of the crucified Jesus, as they said it in Edessa's day. They said Jesus' image on it was not made by human hands. In 1978, the first scientific study of the cloth agreed the image was scientifically determined to not have been made by human hands. The only other way it could have been produced was by some natural mechanism of the physical universe. The 1978 research was, indeed, the first scientific observation of material reality making a simple form of communication, a photograph, wholly by its own processes. 6th century monks spread its likeness from Edessa into all the world, teaching it to be the true likeness of Jesus Christ. To this day, the familiar face of Jesus is patterned after the conspicuous face not made by human hands, peering out from the Shroud of Turin. Gobekli Tepe is only 7 miles from the ancient city of Edessa. It now spreads another amazing likeness of reality into the world, mankind's very early knowledge of biblical themes. Maybe, from the earliest of times, there really was some great importance held about the general area of Edessa. It lays due north of Israel, where the Bible said Satan tried to sit on God's throne, on the Mount of Assembly in the far north. The only other reference in the Bible to the far north regards Jerusalem, God's holy mountain, beautiful in elevation, Mount Zion in the far north, the city of the great king. But Jerusalem, also known as Mount Zion, is literally south of most Israel, not north, let alone far north. Gobekli Tepe and its Pillar 43 are far north of all Israel. Of course, that does not make Gobekli Tepe Jerusalem. Neither does it make it the mountain of God's assembly. But the incredible message encrypted in that monument and its location far north of Israel make this area from which the likeness of Jesus spread throughout the world their perfect metaphor. Most current historians believe Gobekli Tepe was a central place of important religious assembly for at least a millennium of Neolithic time. Most archaeologists regard it to have been deliberately buried. Some suggest it was buried as a time capsule, and now the symbols on Pillar 43 are found to align with the same northern constellations in which can be seen the salvation story told by the same Bible that relates the same flood narrative carved at the top of Pillar 43. This truly amazing phenomena is very real, not conjecture, nor supposition, guesses, or groupthink. It is evidence born of empirical observation. If you watch these videos to their end, you will see another spectacular communication designed into the universe for scientific observation to discover. For those of you who have not watched part 1 of this introduction, or who clicked out of it early, or forgot what it presented, I now give you a few moments of review. Many theologians have demonstrated how the imagery of the classical Western constellations display the gospel of Jesus Christ. The constellations of the northern sky overlay Pillar 43's symbols with the precision of a designer glove. The gospel message demonstrated by each constellation is then found to parallel the sense historians have been able to make of each Neolithic symbol they overlay, maintaining Pillar 43's obsession with God's first prophecy to mankind, the promise of a woman to birth a hero who would crush the ever-enticing serpent's head. The constellation portraying a woman's legs in birthing position overlays the room of the ark upon which sits the water-fowl chick, implying the seed born of a woman as promised in the Bible to crush the serpent's head. You saw Cepheus portraying the King of Kings, and Ursa Minor portraying the nation of Israel overlay the rooms of Noah's ark, whereupon are carved the greatest horn display of all animals and a creeping thing of the earth. You saw Pegasus, the winged horse, bringing to us God's provision, overlay the right wing of the great eagle. Cygnus, God's plan to sacrifice the seed born of the woman, overlays the great eagle's head. Hercules, who descended into the place of the dead and returned from there, overlays the disk on the great eagle's left wing. And you saw how the two constellations expressing the core of that story, Pegasus and Hercules, can be abbreviated into a centaur. You saw the constellation representing the quick return of the resurrected seed of the woman overlay the symbol suspected of meaning new life, the eagle chick. Then you saw how the seed of the woman flies down the left side of Pillar 43 to the place where Sagittarius, a centaur, ends the sting of death for the upright people, but pours God's wrath onto the wayward. These three sets of information, the symbols, the constellations, and their related gospel concepts, rise to the same level of communication as do deliberately stacked rocks. And just as a stack of rocks, in and of itself, clearly evidences the reality of a rock stacker, these gospel-expressive constellations meaningfully overlaying Pillar 43's symbols far north of Israel attest to a message maker, a communicator of important themes, maybe even a forewarner of things to come. For surely, Neolithic man, in and of himself, could not have developed the constellation imagery in excellent accord with the biblical salvation story, for overlaying symbols they carved onto a tidy little pillar. I introduced sufficient evidence in Part 1 for any thinking person to know that Gobekli Tepe and the classical Western constellations were made to correspond with each other very early in human history. You might think it either coincidental or quite supernatural that Francis Rolleston was able to discern all of the concepts of Jesus' gospel in the traditional images of those constellations. However, the real dynamic at play here is that Gobekli Tepe's builders also knew those constellations as well as the story of life after death. The direct correspondence of Pillar 43's symbols with those constellations shows that Greeks did not develop the Zodiac, nor did the Mesopotamians, or even the Sumerians. It was passed down to them all from the people of Gobekli Tepe. The Sumerians, Mesopotamians, Greeks, Romans, and everyone else observing their zodiac afterward twisted its meaning into their own expressions. The intelligible match between the concepts intrinsic within Pillar 43's set of symbols and the gospel concepts Rolleston discerned within classical constellation imagery evidences a knowledge of the Holy Bible's God in the religion and lives of Gobekli Tepe's builders. The biblical narrative of Noah's flood carved on the top register of Pillar 43 affirms that conclusion. Therefore, just as a message carved in Greek onto the Rosetta Stone was able to decipher the same message carved in Egyptian hieroglyphs, Francis Rolleston's Gospel in the Constellations becomes a Rosetta Stone for deciphering Pillar 43's symbols. None of this evidence fits the 21st century perception of reality because our perception of reality follows theories rather than evidence. Liberal science claims the universe happened randomly, without design or purpose. Yet, these three sets of information meaningfully, logically, and evidentially show the universe was purposefully designed for both working and expressing the Holy Bible's salvation story. The traditional scientific method no longer supports the antiquated 18th century theory of a godless, purposeless, non-designed universe. Evidence trumps theory every time, in accord with both reality and Karl Popper's principle. Conclusive evidence now shows that the universe was indeed intricately designed for a very grand purpose. We are now ready to fly our attention back up the middle of Pillar 43 through a set of constellations expressing the death and resurrection of the woman's seed to become King of Kings and Lord of Lords. The Southern Cross conspicuously lays at the base of Pillar 43, underneath the poor headless chap riding the vulture. The Southern Cross represents the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, the sacrifice atoning for our sin and seeding new life for us. A line drawn from its center point through the middle of the disk on the great eagle's wing extends upward to the constellation Cepheus, which portrays the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. For his lowly sacrifice on the cross, Jesus has been risen to the highest authority above all powers. Every symbol of Pillar 43 engages that story. Even the fox jumping onto the pillar bites off Scorpio's death stinger. Corresponding with that image, Victima, the dog receiving Centaurus' lance driven into its heart, elaborates his sacrifice. Gobekli Tepe is filled with images of leaping foxes. The two central pillars of Pillar 43's enclosure portray two people wearing fox hides for loincloths. The Bible story of the fall finds Adam and Eve hiding their nakedness with fig leaves. So God made for them loincloths of animal skin. Considering all of the evidence that Gobekli Tepe is Noah's presentation of Enoch's knowledge, I find it very rational to believe a fox was the animal God sacrificed to make their clothing, and for that reason, to the people of Gobekli Tepe, the constellation Victima did not represent just any old dog, but particularly a fox. You saw in part 1 of this introduction, Hercules and Pegasus offer the best explanation for the origin of the centaur. Here we find the centaur driving his lance into the heart of the fox, representing Christ's willing ascent onto the cross to be sacrificed in our stead. All three constellations overlay the poor headless chap riding the back of the vulture, a Neolithic symbol very well known to represent the process of death. As we ascend the line rising from the Southern Cross, we pass through the shoulder of the headless chap's right arm and brush past the scorpion's stinger. Immense biblical meaning is embedded here, but it must await another video. Before our line crosses through the disc on the great eagle's wing, it passes through Ophiuchus, who represents the sacrificed seed restraining serpents, the snake stretching out to seize Corona Borealis, that diadem awaiting the resurrected seed's return to reign on earth. In part 1, you saw that the downward-facing snake is Draco. Now, notice that the upward-facing snake is Serpens. Both symbols are carved onto Pillar 43 in scale with the rest of the constellation overlay, another direct evidence of the Gobekli Tepe people's knowledge of our constellation imagery. Our line rises on through Hercules, the seed having entered and returned from death, overlaying the head of the poor headless chap, where the 9600 BC celestial North Pole was situated. the place in the sky which the ancients of this area believed to be death's gateway. It is only fitting that our line comes to rest in Cepheus. Cepheus portrays the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. In all of the Middle East, from most ancient times, horns connoted power and authority. Cepheus overlays the room of Noah's Ark, upon which sits the animal with the greatest horn display of all. For the seed's elevation to that position, and for all he brings to us from that position, Lyra, the enchanting tunes of God's glory, lays before the beak of the great eagle. Our introduction has now previewed all but one of the 23 traditional constellations overlaying Pillar 43. The last one for you to see is Libra, the scale weighing a sufficient price paid by the sacrificed seed of the woman. As you have now seen, the ancients carved Pillar 43's symbols to receive these 23 constellations expressive of Jesus Christ's birth, life, preaching, death, resurrection, ascent to heaven, and coming return to earth. The same Bible which tells mankind's salvation story has informed us that this Christ is also the creator of us, earth, the universe, and every other thing that has been created. No greater price could have been paid for us than the humbling of that one to be sacrificed like a lowly goose for the nourishment of all who accept him. Libra, overlaying the right legs of Pillar 43's scorpion, weighs out a payment to God sufficient to buy your soul from eternal death, should you accept the price paid. Now, let's switch keys to see the pillar's symbols speak of the inglorious end coming quickly for all those who deny the sacrifice of the woman's seed. The downward-facing snake deceiving the fallen eye interjects the sense of a different constellation arrangement onto the pillar. Just as a small dot was pecked onto the great eagle's head for receiving Cygnus' center star, Gamma Cygni, to index the gospel overlay onto the pillar, a dot was also pecked onto the head of the eagle chick for receiving Antares, the heart of Scorpio, now indexing the wrath of God overlay onto the pillar. When Scorpio is positioned so its three leading stars touch the waterfowl's lower leg and the head and body of the downward-facing snake, while Antares overlays that dot in the chick's head, Scorpio's tail curls around the head of Pillar 43's scorpion, and its stinger crosses the tips of the great eagle's feet. So many overlapping details and so much symmetry once again shows that Pillar 43 was deliberately designed to receive our well-known constellations, as well as their interpretation discerned by Rolston millennia later. These symbols were arranged to receive Scorpio in this position to that scale. But wait a minute. I thought they were arranged to receive Bootes, Corona Borealis, Victima, Centaurus, and the Southern Cross. Why am I now saying they were arranged to receive Scorpio and Hara? When reading my book to its end, Clear Signs of Trouble and Great Joy, what everyone should know about the Bible, history, and the future from the sky to the earth, you will notice that throughout the book I mention Sethite-like dual prophecy. When reading the Bible to its end, you will also notice that it is filled with dual prophecy and symbols of double meaning. For example, Satan prowls like a lion, yet Jesus is the Lion of Judah. The snake is emblematic of evil, yet the bronze snake which Moses raised on a pole became a metaphor of Jesus' crucifixion. God himself gave King Ahaz the sign of a young woman bearing a child to be named Emmanuel, which also was the prophecy of Mary bearing Jesus some 600 years later. Enoch was the prophet of the same God who inspired the Bible's writing. Pillar 43 is fashioned from the knowledge God showed to Enoch. Therefore, we find it full of symbols used for various meanings. In fact, the whole pillar shows itself to have been made for various overlays. Whereas the poor headless chap riding the vulture represents the death of the woman's seed in the gospel overlay, in the Scorpio overlay, it represents the eternal death of that seed's deniers. For in the Scorpio overlay, Ara now pours the flaming wrath of God onto the poor headless chap. As much as Cygnus, the waterfowl, speaking truth to the upright eye, keys the gospel overlay onto Pillar 43 through Cygnus' position in the great eagle's head, the Scorpio overlay corresponds with Scorpio's heart positioned in the chick's head, as keyed there by the downward-facing snake's tail, mimicking the waterfowl's beak while lying to the fallen eye. There is far too much correspondence between symbols, constellations, biblical themes, memes, and characters for this pillar not to have been the work of Noah, and the constellations not to have been the work of Enoch, great-grandson and great-granddad, both called men of God by the Holy Bible, from which came the gospel concepts perfectly expressed by the imagery of the constellations. I will return to this Scorpio overlay from a different perspective in a moment. But now I must discuss with you the first of two timelines observable in the coherence made by Pillar 43's symbols and the sun's motion through two constellations. In part one of this introduction, I highly emphasized the nature of this pillar and these constellations to be Noah's preaching to our generation, Enoch's warning of the hellacious end of evil and all its doers at Jesus Christ's return. The very first paragraph of Enoch's book explains that his warning was not written to the people of his time, but to those who will be living in the day of tribulation, when all the wicked and godless will be destroyed. I understood that the vision I saw was not for my generation, but for a far distant one. If Pillar 43 was made at Noah's direction to deliver Enoch's warning to that far distant generation, then a rational person would expect to find some indication upon it of having been directed to that generation. One of the first few great mysteries noted about Gobekli Tepe from the time of its initial excavation was its deliberate burial. Why it was buried has only been speculated until now, when you will finally see. If Pillar 43 were indeed Enoch's warning to the generation of the end, all rational speculation would turn to the time capsule theory, an action certainly targeting a far and distant generation, even the generation which discovered it. After all, those who know God well know that he directs people to work history in this very way. But it would only do so if its being a warning were also evidenced beyond speculation. If you are anything like me, you are not at all desiring to accept a proposition of timelines being carved onto archaeology's most ancient monument, timelines actually spanning our very own days, timelines carved there by a Neolithic people to boot. But the evidence of those timelines is actually the same information which forms them, for they are not carved onto the pillar conspicuously appearing to be timelines. Instead, they are composed of the path of moons through the flood waters, the disk resting on the great eagle's wing, and 5 constellations directed into their precise overlays by 4 marks carved right onto the pillar. The timelines themselves are empirically observed realities. Their formation by pure coincidence is possible only if our universe exists down the rabbit hole of Alice's Wonderland. Anywhere else, coincidence made of such complex intricacy is absurd. What is clearly seen through the Bible's eyes is the quickly coming tribulation about which its first prophet, Enoch, warned. If the Bible can be known as the Holy Spirit-inspired writings of some 66 different authors spanning more than 1,500 years of history, then certainly the knowledge of the wise, godly, spirit-directed Enoch can be known as carved onto Pillar 43 by his great-grandson Noah. Having experienced the annihilation of all land-dwelling life outside the ark of God's shelter, surely Noah would have been driven from the depths of his soul to deliver the warning he learned from his great-granddad Enoch. And within that delivery, prophetic timelines are no more unimaginable than are all of the Holy Bible's written prophecies. Today's known fulfillments of most of those prophecies now vouch for not only the rest of the Bible's yet unfulfilled prophecies, but it also vouches for the timelines of Pillar 43 being inspired prophecy rather than entirely impossible coincidence. Therefore, I present to you an introduction of the Sagittarius timeline. I spent several months discovering and analyzing the Sagittarius and Scorpio timelines before I could finally believe them myself. They were both so far unrelated to the 21st century caricature of reality. But if I wanted to follow the same process of investigating evidence to wherever it leads that philosophers say science should do, and the Bible says upright people must do, rather than leading evidence to wherever I would desire it go, then I had to believe what my eyes were seeing. For they were seeing what very real empirical evidence was showing. After all, it was Jesus who talked often about the importance of eyes to see. There is a very conspicuous dot carved at the tip of the great eagle's left wing. Unlike the dots pecked into the great eagle's head, the disc on its wing, and the head of the eagle chick, this dot is raised, and it is so prominent that it draws attention. It almost demands understanding. For when its coherence with the dot in the great eagle's head is discovered, we are almost drawn into what it brings about. Graham Hancock first showed the correlation between the great eagle and Sagittarius. However, his placement of Sagittarius missed these two marks Noah carved onto Pillar 43 for receiving that constellation. When Al-Nasl, Gamma Sagittarii, is placed on that prominent dot, while Lambda Sagittarii is placed on the dot in the great eagle's head, then Sagittarius perfectly overlays the great eagle. And what is Sagittarius but that centaur with bow drawn to shoot Scorpio in the heart? Al-Nasl happens to be the tip of Sagittarius' arrow. The first of double Sethite-like reasons the dot is so prominent. Viewing Sagittarius as the traditional teapot makes it easier to discover the other reason for the prominence of this mark. As the teapot overlays the great eagle in accord with those two marks, that line I drew for you, extending from the center of the Southern Cross through the dot carved onto the poor headless chap's head, is now recognizable as the polar meridian, aligned thusly with Sagittarius at one particular moment of any winter solstice. I discovered this by consulting my Carte du Ciel astronomy software. Once I had discovered the precise position of that line through the many small stars of Sagittarius, then I could take note of where the sun was situated on my Carte du Ciel star constellation chart during whatever year's winter solstice I desired to observe. For the sun appears to advance through the constellations a 72nd of a degree from one year to the next, due to the 26,000-year wobble of the Earth's axis. If Sagittarius, the polar meridian, and the sun were plucked off the constellation chart in precise position with each other and then scaled to overlay Pillar 43 in accord with those two marks I discussed, then the sun might also find a position on the pillar at some particular point in history. I searched for a year wherein the sun was to be found in the vicinity of the waning cusp of Sagittarius. That's when I made my first incredible observation about this overlay. I found the sun at the top edge of that line of 11 moons extending from the great eagle's forehead to the nape of the waterfowl's neck. Zeroing in on the sun's position during other years showed the path of moons to quite obviously be a representation of that piece of the solar ecliptic where the sun can be found on winter solstices spanning 700 years from around AD 1450 to 2150. As the sun moves through the trailing cusp of Sagittarius over many winter solstices, eventually it will move past the end of that section of the solar ecliptic. The next epoch Enoch prophesied will then need a different constellation overlay by which to mark it. As I have demonstrated, Sagittarius marks this epoch. That different constellation is none other than Scorpio. I have called its winter solstice overlay on the pillar the Scorpio timeline. But let's get back to the Sagittarius timeline. Note from the Gospel overlay that only two constellations overlay that path of moons through the flood waters: Draco, representing the evil serpent, and Ursa Minor, representing Israel. Recall that both constellations have harbored the celestial North Pole, Draco in the past and Ursa Minor today. I thought Draco and Ursa Minor might be points on the timeline for indicating some significant historical events. First, allow me to note that these timelines most likely cannot be deciphered into exactingly precise years. Can bulky carvings on crumbly limestone make precise indications to the thousandths of a degree? Most likely not. Can the polar meridian's alignment with Sagittarius at one fleeting moment of the 9600 BC winter solstice be made to a thousandth of a degree and the exact same as the alignment Noah used when carving this pillar? I doubt it. The construction and maintenance of rocket engines requires that degree of accuracy. Deciphering profound concepts only requires effective approximation. Therefore, a reasonably careful realignment of each timeline's elements is sufficient to read whatever prophetic events they were made to highlight. After deciphering the 700-year epoch spanned by the Sagittarius timeline, my attention was next drawn to the point at which the polar meridian crosses the solar ecliptic. The left line of Draco's body crosses the solar ecliptic very close to there. The year my constellation chart showed the polar meridian bisecting the sun at that point was around AD 1775, when America began its trek into nationhood. About this same time, a new breed of philosopher-scientists had set out to discredit the Holy Bible. Their new proposition of a purposeless, non-designed, chance-driven development of the universe bred a new political philosophy. This philosophy first expressed itself in France's murderous Jacobinism, then in Russia's devastating communism, and soon in Hitler's fascistic Holocaust. Had America never existed to join the Allied defense against Hitler, there would have been no Jews remaining to reestablish Israel, the nation God promised to make of Abraham's descendants forever. What more profound point on history's timeline could have been highlighted than the foundation of America, the one-time restrainer of national lawlessness? Maybe the reestablishment of Israel? I needed to know where 1948 was on the timeline. My star charts showed the sun standing just past Draco's tail at 1948. That's when it struck me like a ton of bricks dropped from the moon. That little donut carved just beyond the downward-facing snake's tail represents the sun's 1948 position on the timeline relative to Draco's place in the gospel overlay. They are the prophecy of Israel's reestablishment carved right onto the face of Pillar 43. One side of Draco relates to the restrainer of the snake's great evil, America. The other relates to the nation of God's people who escaped annihilation by America's restraint of that great evil, Adolf Hitler. In another video, I will expound upon the polar meridian rising through Ophiuchus, the snake restrainer, to bisect the AD 1775 sun as if to indicate America's purpose for restraining national evil. The pillar itself affirms the importance of that concept. The actual images of only 2 constellations are carved onto Pillar 43 in proportion with the other constellations overlaying its symbols. Both represent the snake. One is Serpens, restrained by Ophiuchus. The other is Draco. There, amongst the coherence of symbols, constellations, gospel concepts, and known history, is the striking prophecy of America's establishment to safeguard Israel's reestablishment. And behold, a holy day tetrad began the year after Columbus discovered America. As we will discuss in my next video, a holy day tetrad is 4 total lunar eclipses occurring 6 months apart, the first on the Jewish holy day Passover, the next on the Jewish holy day Tabernacles, the third on Passover again, and the fourth on Tabernacles again. And then, as an emphatic double down, another holy day tetrad began the year after Israel was reestablished. All of this together is light years beyond any possibility of coincidence to form. This exists by nothing less than orderly design for the specific purpose of showing the truth of God's existence, work, and Holy Bible. So it was written, so let us obey. Why? Those Jewish holy days on 4 total lunar eclipses in a row form signs in the sun, moon, and stars, which lead faithfully curious minds into a truly enormous system of signs affirming this very gospel message showing on Pillar 43. They are the heavens declaring the glory of God day by day and night by night of Psalm 19. So also, just as we've now seen signs on the pillar do, they indicate the approximate year of Jesus Christ's return to be 2036. My Carte du Ciel star chart places the 2036 sun on the ecliptic where it is overlaid by Ursa Minor, Israel's constellation. The Bible states that Israel will be raised above all other nations at Jesus' return. He will reign there for 1,000 years. And at his return, all the stars of the heavens will be revolving around Polaris, the star at the tip of Ursa Minor's tail. A little more than 100 years later, the winter solstice sun will move beyond the solar ecliptic represented on the Sagittarius timeline by that path of moons through the great flood waters. But Enoch had more for Noah to say. As the winter solstice sun will have moved farther beyond the end of the path of moons, the constellation overlay must shift to to keep this sign on the pillar until the sun will have reached the middle of Jesus' millennial reign on earth. At that time, the Scorpio overlay I discussed earlier will have aligned onto the pillar, and with the polar meridian represented by the same line passing through the poor headless chap's shoulder on through the center of the disk on the great eagle's wing, the solar ecliptic now traverses the middle of that disk from AD 2477 through 2736, completing the 7th century of Jesus' reign. What events of great biblical significance could be foretold there? The 500th anniversary of Jesus' reign happens there at AD 2536, its 10th Jubilee. Beyond that, we can only speculate. As the current world's descent into our modern spiritual abyss of secularism took several centuries, might some philosophical process leading to almost the entire world's rebellion against Jesus at Satan's release from the bottomless pit also take several centuries to develop? 7 is the biblical number of complete spirituality. Could the completion of Jesus' 7th century of reign be when such a philosophical shift might begin, likewise developing over 3 centuries, just as today's scientific deceit developed over the span of 3 centuries? Maybe. There are far more correlations between the Holy Bible, Pillar 43, the constellations, total lunar eclipses, and history than what I have shown you in these first 3 videos. Several videos will be necessary to cover all of the implications made by those 23 constellations intersecting Pillar 43 in the light shining from God's Word and the signs He makes by the sun, moon, and stars. Together, all these correlations mount up like a stack of rocks, and like a stack of rocks evidences the existence of a rock stacker, all this correlation evidences the existence of a message maker from the heavens, a forewarner of things to come. So we can indeed know Enoch's knowledge is carved on Noah's monument to warn our generation of Jesus Christ's return to end all evildoers for the beginning of all righteousness. Jesus warned that his return would be as the days of Noah were. Noah warned of the flood back then. Nobody listened. Don't repeat their mistake. Turn to the coming truth. Pillar 43 and Gobekli Tepe were buried to be unearthed for your encouragement to humbly follow all evidence to that truth. Turn your life over to Jesus Christ. Get yourself a Bible and begin discovering what a spiritually dynamic place this temporal universe really is. Or do you need more evidence? As you learned in part 1 of this introduction, the 1st century Jews held very highly the ancient history book called Jasher. Its stories parallel the Bible's stories. However, unlike the Bible, it gives a date for almost every one of its stories. It does not fail to date Abraham's birth. Whether its date for his birth is actual or not, it is still most astoundingly Anno Mundi 1948, 1,948 years after the day of creation. Then, by applying information from the Bible to well-known dates of historical events, careful scholarship calculates 1947 BC as the year Abraham was born. As such, history flowed 1,948 years from the day of creation to the birth of the man of faith. Then, 1,948 years again to the birth of the man of salvation, and then another 1,948 years to the reestablishment of that little nation from which the resurrected man of salvation will reign when he returns. The very year after Israel became a nation began an amazing pattern made by 3 holy day tetrads. The first holy day tetrad began a 67-year span of time, ending at the last year of the third holy day tetrad, 2015. The end of the first year of the second holy day tetrad divided that 67-year time span into 19 years and 48 years, 1948 again. In other words, the first 6 of those 12 total lunar eclipses occur over a 19-year time span, while the remaining 6 occur over the next 48 years. This amazing piece of stellar artwork made by these 12 total lunar eclipses of those 3 holy day tetrads was first shown to us by John Hagee in his book, 4 Blood Moons. Something is about to change. Although they were much discussed among the eschatological community, the phenomena was never explored further. But I expected God's signs in the sun, moon, and stars to be more complete. So I explored NASA's Lunar Eclipse Catalog, expecting to find more sets of 3 tetrads, likewise encoding 1948. I found 32 of them. Every one occurred while some process or event significantly affecting God's salvation plan was happening on earth. For example, the first 2 occurred while Joseph was Pharaoh's vizier. 5 occurred during the history of Israel and Judah. Another occurred when Alexander the Great was spreading Greek culture around the known world. And another when the Old Testament was translated into Greek. 2 occurred while the early church was being persecuted by Rome, and another occurred when Rome became a Christian empire. 1 occurred when the Shroud of Turin, Jesus' burial cloth, was carried from Edessa to Constantinople, and another when that shroud joined the annals of acknowledged history in the 14th century. And yes, Christopher Columbus discovered America while one of these signs of witness winked and blinked above. The 23rd is the only one composed of all 12 total lunar eclipses occurring on Passovers and Tabernacles. But the final 12 of the 32 affirm and underscore these 2 timelines found on Pillar 43, the last 6 occurring while the sun passes through the disk on the great eagle's wing in the Scorpio timeline, and the 6 preceding those happening while the sun moves across the path of moons in the Sagittarius timeline. If this is merely coincidental, then I am the Cheshire Cat, and we are all down the rabbit hole.
But Grandpa is not that cat, and Jesus is coming to pull Earth out of its delusional rabbit hole. Everything Grandpa has told you is neither theory nor speculation. All of it is empirically observable by eyes to see, now seeing what is scientifically discernible. The biblical narrative of the Great Flood is most obviously carved across Pillar 43's top, and the pillar symbols were most carefully positioned to meaningfully correspond with every constellation of near 1/2 of the far northern sky. From Era's burning wrath spewing out of the beak of the lower vulture, to Lyra's song from the beak of the great eagle. From Cepheus in the room of the animal with the greatest horn display, to the Southern Cross underneath the poor headless chap. All 23 constellations of this piece of sky dance to the same tune as do Pillar 43's symbols, a tune of death, resurrection, new life, and King of Kings. From the woman promised to bear the seed for crushing the serpent's head, to the sacrificial crucifixion of the seed God had in mind. It is now undeniably evidence that these ancient people not only knew the same constellations we know today, but understood them through the same biblical meanings Francis Rolleston demonstrated they portrayed. Pillar 43 symbols, the constellations, and the Holy Bible salvation narrative together construct a message not even the Cheshire Cat could design, nor could coincidence form. To a world spoiled by the delusions of careless, biased, and deceitful philosophers and scientists, the Holy Bible's God has sent to our generation rock-solid evidence for empirically substantiating his reality by simple observation. As Jesus would say it, by eyes to see. In our next video, we will see the universe itself chanting the glory of this God through the great rock in the sky, sent to alert a denying world of Jesus Christ's return. The return of that rock, which followed Israel through the desert, dispensing refreshing waters of great joy.
I tell you, Jesus calmly replied to those Pharisees, if these were silent, the very stones would cry out. Our scientifically deceived generation is silent about Jesus' return. The 21st century, neither cold nor hot, Laodicean church is being silent about this comforting, encouraging, spiritually inciting wonder of the Lord God's communication being made directly to our 21st century generation of the end, the generation to whom Enoch addressed his book. Because silence in the face of God's amazing communication is being chosen by the influential people of today, those metaphorical Pharisees of our time, then these rocks, Pillar 43, Apophis, and the rock at Rephidim, are crying out the glory of his approaching return, just as Jesus said the rocks would do in the face of mankind's silence. There are far too many correlations cohesively revolving around one biblical theme for all of this to be merely coincidental. These are no coincidences. They are messages from our Creator to get our spiritual affairs in order, because the truth is coming to reign on earth. And that will be eternally disastrous for every deceiver. Do not deceive yourself with 21st century philosophy. Do not blind yourself with 21st century science. Get yourself a Bible. Read it. Obey it. Call on Jesus Christ to save your soul from eternal death today. Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come into him and eat with him, and he with me. He who conquers, I will grant him to sit with me on my throne, as I myself conquered and sat down with my Father on his throne. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches.